שלום, ניהאו, וברוכים הבאים ללהבין את סין, הערוץ שלכם לכל מה שצריך לדעת על המעצמה שתעצב את המאה ה-21, ובפרק היום אני מארח אורחת נהדרת, שהאמת שרציתי שתשתתף כאן בפרק כבר הרבה זמן, קאריס וויטי, שהיא בעצם המייסדת, ומי שעומד בראש מכון סיגנל, שזה מכון שעוסק הרבה ביחסים בין ישראל לסין, ואיך אפשר ליצור יחסים מיטיבים לכל הצדדים. קאריס דוברת אנגלית, הרעיון יהיה באנגלית, יש לה המון ידע, תובנות וניסיון רלוונטי, אני חושב שיהיה פרק מאוד מעניין, אז תהנו ונתחיל. Shalom, ni hao, and hello, and welcome to להבין את סין, קאריס.
Ni hao, xie, happy to be here.
Very happy to have you here, finally. We've been talking about this for a while. So I guess we can talk about so many things. There are a few things in specific that we want to focus on. But maybe before we start that, can I ask you to tell us a little bit about your personal story and how you got to focus on China and then on the Israeli-China relationship in specific?
Well, one of the great things about being old is that when someone asks you that question, you can go way back into ancient history. And actually, I entered college when Deng Xiaoping announced reform and opening up. But wow. I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't watching China in 1979. But by the end of 1980, I had declared my major as Chinese studies. Okay. And the reason I chose Chinese studies, because it was not
that was
China,
in the States, right?
Yes, I was at Yale University, and I wanted to do a culture study, foreign language, and I really didn't have a specific direction. And I got some advice from my father. He said, why not China? Eventually, it's going to be running the world. Yeah. So this was obviously way before that was a possibility.
Yeah. But the smart people got it, back then, folks like Napoleon, Ben-Gurion, right. Your father.
Exactly. Probably very similar personalities. Yeah. But anyway, I found out that Yale had an outstanding China program. They had been dealing with China for 100 years. I didn't know that at the time. And began and it was fascinating. I think almost everybody who touches on China finds it fascinating. The history is incredible. The culture is beautiful. The art is amazing. It's a very exciting exploration. So I did that. And my career path was intended to be documentary film. And after college, I actually had an opportunity to work on a documentary film for public television in New York in China.
Oh,
and I was assisting, and I was the China speaker, and this was 1984. So
what a time to visit China.
Exactly, and it was very different, but quite similar to what I experienced when I returned there in 2010. So basically, I spent the better part of 84 and 85 in China.
Whereabout? In Beijing?
All across the country. The documentary went to a few different cities, but I also did traveling. So I, was in Yunnan. It was a very different time when you need a visa to go to China, but you needed a visa to leave the city.
Yeah.
And so it was an experience, and I, show up with my red hair, and no one had seen foreigners, much less a person with red, and at the time, extremely curly, gigantic hair. Yeah. And, they would just want to swarm around me and touch it to see if it was real.
Yeah.
So it was, that was not at all what you would find in China years later.
Yeah.
But the basic, deeper culture stays. Yeah. And in 1987, I made Aliyah. I had grown up not really Zionist or religious, but discovered Israel in 1985 and decided I have to make Aliyah, that this is my home.
Lucky for us.
Thank you. And for me, because really with all the things that we have been through, and, people who were older than me and born here have been through more, but, since 1987, plenty.
Yeah.
Plenty of wars, plenty of operations, plenty of difficulties, not even to mention what we've been going through since October 7.
Yeah.
I would never want to live anywhere else. I love Israel, and I'm really, really happy to be here, and I feel very privileged to be able to try to contribute on the China track, which is an odd one for Israel, not one that the Israeli establishment looks at in a very serious way, at least generally, because China does not have a gun to our head or a knife to our throat. And, in Israel, if that's not the case, you're not a problem, because we have so many other problems that are, urgent emergency, which we are living through right now.
Yeah.
At the same time, China is a huge factor. It has become, it's grown into becoming one of the most significant global factors in geopolitics, economics, society, everything.
Everything. Yeah.
And so ignoring China is clearly a mistake. And
just to put things in perspective, when you came here, when you made Aliyah in 1987, Israel did not even have proper diplomatic ties with China.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. All my China background in 1987 was useless.
Yeah.
I tried, couldn't do anything with it, left it all behind. And only in about 2009, when I wanted to try to do something to help neutralize the delegitimization of Israel that I had been living through, especially in the first and second Intifada, I found the global opprobrium for Israel was too overwhelming, and wanted to find a way to sort of set the record straight. It seems crazy.
Just reminding folks that maybe are not, does not have enough time on this planet, that what we're seeing in campuses today is much more, or in social media, wherever, is maybe feels much more intense because also of the channels and how visible it is and how quickly information spread. But in the first couple of intifadas, it wasn't. It was maybe that more restrained, less comprehensive in terms of where you would encounter it.
It was on the state level.
Yeah.
It wasn't on social media. There was no social media, obviously.
And you could feel it maybe sometimes when you go abroad and hear what people think and things like that, but it wasn't so obvious for anyone that has a smartphone and suddenly access all the anti-Semitic
You're absolutely
bullshit.
right. And yet I found it overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I ended up doing some research and finding that there was not much happening between Israel and China in 2009. Which was mainly a result of the Falcon and Harpy. I don't know if you want to go into that story very briefly.
We can briefly, just for background, because I think it is important. I just wrote about Jiang Zemin's visit to Israel in 2000, which was, in a way, under that umbrella. I want to make sure he seals that deal.
Sure.
And it didn't happen.
Very
but
sad.
Maybe you can say...
The only time that a Chinese president ever came to Israel and for an amazing, huge defense deal that collapsed. It was done originally in the 90s when the U.S. wanted Israel to help pull China out of the Soviet Union orbit and encouraged defense sales. And then the Berlin Wall fell and the U.S. position changed and the deal was supposed to close. They had already paid a $300 million down payment, which back then was quite a lot of money. And when the deal was supposed to be finalized, the Americans said, oh, no, you can't do that. And it created a powerful problem for U.S.-Israel relations, actually more problematic than the than the Israel-China relations, because it's true that deal fell through and China did a sort of shvita italkit. They didn't change official ties, but they didn't really engage diplomatically at all with Israel for the following few years. However, that relationship was quite superficial. We only had a defense and intelligence relationship since 1992 when we got official relations. Prior to that, China had observed the Arab boycott, and the only connection it had with Israel was under-the-table defense purchases of sort of secondhand Soviet material through Saul Eisenberg.
Right. That's back in the 80s, even before the diplomatic relations.
That's right. And so even in the 90s, Israel didn't seem to have a wish list for what it wanted from China. Mm-hmm. China's interests were defense and intelligence, and so that's what the relationship was. So when it fell apart,
with a touch of agricultural technology.
Of course, absolutely, and water. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
for many years, but and by the way, they continued to buy the agricultural
because
equipment.
That was something they really needed, and it was also safe to sell.
Absolutely.
Say. Yeah.
That because that relationship was relatively limited, the fallout was limited. The relationship with America was and is so deep, so complex, so integrated that the reverberations were powerful, and a high-level official had to be fired on the insistence of the U.S. and I think the Pentagon, the State Department, a lot of bad blood as a result of that, which is, I find it to be the whole thing quite disturbing, because part of the problem that Israel has is that it goes and asks for permission, it gets the permission, but then America changes its mind. We saw the same thing over the Haifa port. Right. If I can just jump, it was a very similar story where the mayor of Haifa went to, and this is a story by Ambassador Shapiro, he tells the story that the mayor came to him and said, can you please bring me American shipping companies who would run the port, the new private port or terminal at the new private port in Haifa.
Yeah.
And Ambassador Shapiro said, I will try. And he came back and said, look, there's only 2 companies who do it. One is all the way in California. And they said, this is too small a project for them. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
So the mayor said, can you please find out if it's okay for me with the administration to go to my friend, the mayor of Shanghai, and see if he can recommend a company to do this.
Yeah.
And the answer from the Obama administration was yes.
Yeah.
And then, cut ahead a few years, and Trump is reading tweets about the Haifa port being run for 25 years by the Chinese, and it gets very upset. And then all of a sudden, Israel is considered to be be on the back foot and had done the wrong thing by allowing that to happen.
And we should also maybe add that, there are plenty of Chinese advanced equipment in some of the biggest U.S. ports as well. It's not like the U.S. stays completely off it, but it's
You're absolutely right. You could call it double standard. Yeah. And on top of that, it never posed a security threat. Israel is very security aware. Yeah. I think we can all.
Absolutely.
I do realize that October 7 was a bizarre and horrible set of mistakes, but in general, Israel's very security-minded. Yeah. And I think anyone who visits the country from abroad recognizes that right away.
Of course.
And they had done a full security impact study beforehand and in the middle, and probably again for the U.S. And it turned out that is not a security threat, and the Chinese are still running the terminal, and everything is fine. And by the way, next door is the Indian-run terminal by Adani. Right. So, good competition.
Right. And we should also say that from purely commercial and economic perspective, that made a huge progress in terms of Israel's capabilities in terms of port and offloading shipments and so on. It's just a completely different standard to what we had before. So it's basically a lot of wins and a sort of ambiguous possible security breach that Israel should be able to
I think it's a psychological issue more than a real potential for a security breach. In any country, if you have a serious conflagration, you can nationalize the port very quickly. So, or any port. So I don't see that that was an actual issue. But the U.S. has its policies, and the U.S. does provide tremendous amount of support. But actually, the U.S. also does benefit quite a lot. And we have to remember that the relationship with Israel is not one way. Yeah. Israel contributes hugely to military technology for the U.S., not to mention, as many people have said, U.S. battleship in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I think many of our neighbors agree again, we have this caveat of October 7, but nonetheless, I think one of the issues about China that is repeated is its assessment of the Middle East and what's happening here, how it makes these decisions and how it comes to its assessments. On the one hand, one of the factors informing these decisions is Chinese policy, regardless of what's happening on the ground. That policy will drive the Chinese thinking, and you can't move it left or right. I've tried.
Yeah. Of course.
And on the other hand, I think there's a lot of, I'm not sure if it's misinterpretation, lack of a deeper understanding of the region, willful self-interest, because the Chinese have said repeatedly that they follow the Arabs. So what the Arabs do, they will do in this region. They have an official pro-Palestinian policy, and that is fine.
That goes way, way, way back.
Right, and they stick with that no matter what, and that's and they've been very clear about that. And we have always been very clear about our relationship with the U.S.
Right.
And frankly, those two relationships have impacted our direct relationship from day one.
Yeah.
That, as I said, China chose to join the Arab boycott. Israel hesitated in advancing relations in the early years before the Bandung Conference in 1955 out of concerns of what the U.S. may want. And as we just discussed, over the years, the U.S. has had influence on Israel's decisions and choices. So those who have said, we don't want to take a side, or we are on the, we're worried about the Chinese view, letting them know that we're on the American side. They know we're on the American side.
Yeah.
And they have known that for many, many years. And in fact, I was told by some Chinese scholars maybe 10 or 12 years ago that they had figured out they could use Israel to get to the U.S. or, sort of stick it to the U.S. the way the U.S. uses Taiwan, at least then, to stick it to China. So not that Israel and Taiwan are at all comparable as their relations with U.S. and China, but the understanding about this close and intense relationship between Israel and the U.S. plays out in China in many different ways.
Yeah, Israel is in a way seen or was seen at least, as a bridge to the U.S. in some ways, and also as a bypass to some of the, I'd say, U.S. restrictions, let's say, or willingness, because for a long time also it seemed like China's main interest in Israel in the past decade, I would say, was mainly technology. And that was seen as, okay, everything that we might not be able to do with U.S., acquiring U.S. companies, we can do that in Israel through cooperation, through acquisitions and so on. But I think that started changing way before October 7. And we'll talk about China's response to October 7 and where that came from. But I'd say probably around 2018 was the peak of Chinese investments in Israel. And I remember that working in the tech sector back then and focusing on the China-Israel cooperation in the tech sector. Everything was flourishing. There was tons of interest from Chinese companies and big VCs and major players in the Chinese economy that were visiting Israel regularly, investing here, looking for cooperation opportunities. And then once the trade war started, you started noticing that change in tone. And at least the way I experienced it, at first it was very nuanced, and the Israelis felt like, okay, we just shouldn't stick it in the face to the Americans because we'll probably still do business. But the Chinese started being more cautious on their side as well, in a way trying to, again, bypass certain U.S. restrictions, but also understanding that a lot of the things that they might follow here will not follow through. And I think that was the line in the sand, but I'm wondering, how do you experience that in terms of the cooperation
It's
that you're working on?
really interesting that you talked about originally the idea was the things you couldn't get in America, you couldn't get here. And actually, in 2012, we brought the delegation from the Central Party School, which is, for your audience, the education/training of the party line for all the top leaders.
Yeah.
So ambassadors, like the lowest level, you have all of the Politburo and all of the provincial governors, all of the party secretaries who are very high, that's the highest level.
Yeah.
They're all trained at the Central Party School. So we brought the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which deals with policy recommendations to the leadership. And at the time, or when we first went to the Central Party School, they still had the tradition of the person who was going to become president of the country was president of the school.
Yeah.
So when I first went there, Xi Jinping was president. We didn't actually
interesting.
meet him, but he certainly signed off on our visit in 2011. And then in 2012, we hosted them here in Israel. And one of the comments that they made sort of among themselves in Chinese was, you know, all that technology that we're trying to get from America and we're having such a hard time, we don't have to worry about it. We can get it in Israel because anyway, a lot of the technology, this was what they picked up on after hanging around Israel for a week. A lot of it is from Americans who are Jewish and make aliyah. Well, they didn't say make aliyah, you know, they say move to Israel.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of an exaggeration, but
Yes.
it does absolutely fit with the assumption, you know, that they made that you articulated. And I think that was very much on their mind. And then, of course, Israel was seen as a way of accessing Congress and accessing the White House. Many countries have felt that way. So that period, the sort of golden years that you described was really just after Signal started, or after I launched it in late 2010.
So let's maybe talk about that for a sec.
Sure.
So you mentioned 2009, you wanted to think about, okay, how can I use my expertise and knowledge and background and really cultivate the Israeli-China relations? And then you started Signal, basically, right?
Right. So it was, the issue of cultivating relations was sort of the method. The goal was how to strengthen Israel's position vis-a-vis China. And at the time, we needed to leapfrog 60 years or so of no relations.
Right.
And at the time, almost no relations as well, 2009. We were both, two countries that had done not too bad after the subprime crash of 2008.
Yeah.
And still we were not doing much with each other at all. There were 5 Chinese students in Israel at the time. It was really bizarre.
Yeah.
And I did some research and I learned that there were Jewish studies centers in China, but no Israel studies. No one was studying about Israel at all. We had Asian studies, Chinese studies here, but nothing on Israel there. So I started to build this strategy, and it was very much based on the 1,400-year-old imperial exam system concept that scholars are policy advisors. And so if you can tap into that market sector, identify who are sort of more relevant for our area, our region, and cultivate those ties, those relationships, and then bring together experts from Israel who know Middle East. I'm not the expert on that. And we would bring all kinds of she'avarim, former ambassadors, former national security advisor, former variety of diplomats, as well as experts. And have them sit together and dialogue, discuss, and share Israel's insights and viewpoint of all of these issues, and little by little chip away at the misconceptions and misrepresentations of Israel that had really consumed Beijing, the center of policy power, and in general across the country, because the only information they had was media, and we all know how much accuracy there is in media regarding Israel, and many, 56 Muslim country ambassadors in Beijing, plus all the ambassadors Chinese ambassadors who went and served in those countries, came back.
All the Middle East experts in China are basically Arabists. They're not.
Absolutely.
None of them are.
Absolutely. So you're talking about a huge coterie of people who are anti-Israel or speaking anti-Israel. I would say anti-Israel, inaccurate, and from a skewed perspective. And then in 1992, we get one ambassador.
Yeah.
In the face of all of that. So the
Very
idea...
good ambassador, by the way.
Yeah, yes.
Nonetheless,
Yeah. Numbers and size matter.
Yeah, of course.
So the idea was to find a way to countermand that situation in a really cost-effective way because I didn't have any money.
Right.
And so the idea was to start with these briefings, dialogues in China, and also at the same time think about the future. In my research, I learned that Germany, France, Australia, America, they all had so many students in China and Chinese students there. And those students would go on into business, into engineering, into government. And then they would call their friends, we have a contract or we need to do this or that. And Israel was never going to be on that list because we didn't have any exchange whatsoever.
I can tell you just from my personal experience, one of the things that I say a lot, you could see I was on a scholarship from the Chinese government after I finished my East Asian studies, right about that time, 2008, 2009. But I think there were overall, 8 students from Israel all over China that got this scholarship. And then you saw countries like, in my school, I studied in Renmin Dashwe, and only there in the foreign students dormitory, you had like tens of people from India. But India, okay, it's a very big country.
Turkey.
But then, again, Turkey. And
Kazakhstan,
tons of them.
All over Africa.
Yep. Amazing. Like the tiniest countries, like the Equatorial Guinea. I had like 4 students in my school.
Yeah.
I think I don't know how many people even live there.
Yep.
But you could see how like that reflects China's relations with that country and how important China perceives that country to be for their
and
interest.
And vice versa.
Exactly.
And Israel had, suffered that shock of the Falcon and Harpy.
Yeah.
It wasn't so excited about interaction with China. China had sort of the similar feelings, although I think China was making some motions towards Israel from 2007. But Israel didn't pick up on it, and it wasn't important enough to push. But anyway, 2010, I said we need to have Israel studies in universities, and we need to have them embedded inside the departments, because if you put them on external, then when someone quits or retires or whatever, that center can die or disappear.
Yeah, right.
So we began with, modest amount of funding to provide a scholarship for faculty, not student exchange, too expensive. And anyway, soon after we started, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Economy came up with a scholarship program for student exchange, bringing something like 200 or 250 students a year from China and India, and I think most of them ended up coming from China.
Yeah.
They were mainly for science and math, which I did not understand because I thought there are other areas of study that would be more valuable for the relationship. Yeah. But anyway...
but from China's perspective, I guess this is what was most lucrative about Israel, is like
that was interesting for them, technology. Sure. But it was an Israeli government-funded program. Right. Nonetheless, we brought faculty. We trained them here and in a master's degree program in Israel Studies. And then, they were already faculty. They already were professionals, so they could learn and integrate and collect a whole bibliography from the university and then go back. And we also helped them prepare a course. They would go back and teach the course. So you would get hundreds and hundreds of students out of one faculty. And on top of that, it was their teacher teaching them. And in China, the professor or the lecturer carries a high status. I mean, I think it's a different relationship in Israel, but they're very highly respected. Yes. And if the teacher, faculty, lecturer, etc., says that this is an important and interesting topic, then students come.
We treat it as such, yeah.
And so thousands of students have passed through these courses over the years. We have trained over 70 faculty across the country in a couple of very top universities and, second-tier universities across China. They're very, very important universities that filter into diplomacy, foreign affairs, business, teaching.
That's extremely important, and really I think also Signal, like the initials that Signal stands for, is also about academic exchange, right?
Right.
And
right.
So how did you see that progress along the years? I mean,
so it really flourished, and in fact, it still exists after October 7.
That's good to know.
Yeah, we have been told that the faculty need to keep a low profile, that we should keep a low profile, but continue working and continue doing all the things we do. Yeah. So this year, we usually have between 3 and 7 faculty each year, depending on our finances mainly. And but this year, although we have a budget for 3, only 1 is coming because of the war, but 1 is still coming.
That's nice, because I know that right now, anyone that holds an official position in China, to have them come officially to Israel has become a very, very difficult task to carry.
I think many are refraining from coming to Israel at this time for many reasons, partly because of that, partly because of the danger that they perceive.
Yeah. I heard a lot from a lot of Chinese folks that as long as this is officially declared a country in a state of war, then it's just like a switch in the system that prevents many people from even going.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, going to a war zone is not something most people are interested in doing. But anyway, there was a huge interest and demand from China for the things that we were doing, and the Chinese, when I say Chinese, I'm talking about research institutes, government and party institutes, agencies, and they would run conferences, and they would want to bring Israelis, so they would contact us, and we would provide the people, and we were sort of a bridge in many different ways that we hadn't expected, but were extremely happy to accommodate, because it was helping create this mutual understanding. And I would make 4 trips a year and have, I think I've led well over 1,000 briefings if you take each one of these meetings. And we've had really impressive, wonderful people from Israel joining me each time, and everybody does it for free. They all donate their time, and they're happy to do it because, as General Amidror has said, and Ron Prosor, Ambassador Ron Prosor, it's the most efficient way to get a huge range of top-level input from China, in person.
Yeah.
Because our access allows for having, and I'm very cost conscious because it's always difficult to raise enough money for something like this. And so we have many, many meetings, and they get to meet so many people really across the range. And
that's so important, and something that's so missing, I think, in a lot of I don't know if it's the Israeli way of thinking about the relationship with China, but everyone that did enough business in China know that, things don't just work, even after COVID, don't just work in Zoom meetings and emails and stuff like that. You have to be there on the ground to meet them face to face, to go and spend time together. This is how you create this relationship, and this is how you get real insights into what's going on, other than just like official blurbs that they would send you in an email or repeat in a video call.
You couldn't be more right. And that old relationship, Lao Pangyo, being an old friend, really carries weight. Yeah. And it opens doors that would otherwise be very difficult for them to open. Yeah. They are allowed to do something with someone who is an old friend that they cannot do with someone who might even have a more official position.
Yeah.
And so for us, it's been, it has allowed, having that historical relationship has allowed us to continue. My last trip to China before COVID was November 2019. Yeah. And I was back at the end of October of 2023. That was my first time back. And I was there in June. I'm going back in next month in September for a conference and for more meetings. And it is, as you say, it is very important to keep that communication going and ensure that we are, that we're having more interactions, because at the end of the day, China's not going anywhere. Israel's not going anywhere, much to maybe the dismay of some. Yeah. But we're not going anywhere. And both countries need to have a relationship with the other. And
this kind of people-to-people interaction is super critical in fostering that, especially in hard times like this.
But I do want to go back to 2018, because your perspective, you're dealing with business, and it's a really critical. I mean, that's probably the most important aspect of the relationship from China's perspective. Yeah. But from my perspective, I'm always dealing with the academic policy relationships. And you talked about 2018. I had a different perspective. Although I know everything that you said is correct. At the same time, China changed some of its regulations on foreign investment. Yeah. Right. And they weren't allowed to send money out.
It's much harder to take money out of China for whatever reason.
So that is a huge, not just for Israel, generally.
Yeah.
So that had a big effect in 2018. Also, as much as you talk about, there was lots of action and many delegations, only a small percentage of those delegations actually put money on the table. And doing business with China is overwhelmingly difficult. And that brass ring that President Xi Jinping holds up of 1.4 billion people as a market is a bit misleading. Yeah. First of all, it's more like 400 million, which is still in a gigantic market, but go try to enter it. Yeah. It is extremely expensive. You need tremendous longevity, deep pockets, a lot of patience. I think check, all the things Israel does not have.
Yeah.
Most of our companies
have lots of scars to support your claim.
I bet you do. I was asked to help facilitate maybe 10 deals or 12 deals over the years, between, say, 2012 and 2018. Yeah. Not one ever came through, even though they came from the most trusted people, and, they really needed it. It was so agriculture and water and cleaning the land, that had been poisoned from all of the industrial development. Yeah. Not one went through. And I was just helping. It was all those people who were investing so much of their time, and it came to nothing. And frankly, by 2000, I think even 17, Israel was suffering from China fatigue. They did not want, we would be contacted by many delegations wanting to come. These were from municipalities, from provinces, from private companies, from agencies. And I would, and my team, we would try to set meetings for them, and people just did not want to meet them. They said, it's not worth it. They come, they see, they check, they leave.
Yeah, and a lot of time the feeling that people had was that they just came here to, quote unquote, spy on them and understand what they're doing or whatever, which is not really true. A lot of time there's a lot of facade involved, and things like that. But I have to say on that regard that when I spent a few years doing that, I already had like a whitelist and a blacklist of Chinese firms and entities that I knew with these guys, they mean business. They want to make the deal. They're not here just for, show off and stuff like that. And others are not. And I think it's very important to and you only get that by experience. There's no other way.
Sure.
Because I really had a lot of scars from the people I put on the blacklist. But a lot of very big deals came true with the guys on the white list.
Yes.
And there are, and I think that tends to be more the private sector a lot of times than the government or
I'm sure
SOEs.
I'm sure you're right. It makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't use the word spying. I definitely would use the word research.
Yeah. No, it's definitely, that's what I said with the air quotes.
Yeah, we have a lot of...
that was the feeling the Israelis got. You know, it's not really true.
But I mean, they would come, it's just standard business policy, but the problem is it happened too many times, which is that they would research here and then they'd go buy from some other country, a similar thing or whatever.
Yeah.
So there was a high frustration level. And I think, business was always difficult. It was hard for the Chinese as well. Dealing with Israelis is hard for...
completely different business cultures.
Right. Yeah. And completely different mindset. We would constantly talk about the very, very top-down nature of the thinking in China and the very, very bottom-up nature of the thing. And there was no...
connection point.
There was no like mechubar,
mechaber,
connector, machbar, thank you, to make that happen. And so it didn't really happen enough.
Right.
And I think that's the issue is the percentage. The percentage just wasn't high enough for people to be more open. Anyway, the trade war did start, and I agree with you. We started to see a lot of self-selection, that if they felt that the market was U.S., they wouldn't take Chinese money in the private sector, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But then we moved into COVID, and it was really a game changer. What happened during COVID was a game changer in so many ways. China, President Xi Jinping, I think, did a lot of reassessing or implementing things that he had been wanting to do, perhaps, and didn't find the right opportunity. Hong Kong is one of them. We saw policy in Xinjiang, and it became also the Belt and Road started. Its reputation started to come into question, with a lot of countries running into debt. I don't believe China intended for that debt.
I'm with you on that, but that was the narrative, let's say, in the West.
Regardless, they're opportunistic, and so they did capitalize on the debt that those countries ran into. Now, for example, Hambantota, that was where...
That's the famous port in Sri Lanka. That's like the poster child of the so-called debt trap.
Right. And what happened was, they borrowed and ran into debt, to the point that they had to sign over a 99-year lease of the Hambantota port to China. Yeah. And I sat with the Chinese, and the Chinese were incredulous. Why are people criticizing us? They ran into debt. They wanted us to take the port. That's how they wanted. And I said, but look at the optics. Yeah. You were very upset that you had to sign over Hong Kong to the British for 99 years. Yeah. And now you sign a 99-year lease on Hambantota. How does that look?
Well, across from India, and, again, optics-wise doesn't look good.
Is it worth it? Well, anyway, that was the choice that they made.
And a lot of time, we have to say, a lot of times also in Africa and places like that, they say, okay, your collaterals would be mining rights, for example, for a certain mine. If you cannot pay that debt, if you can pay the debt, it's a normal debt deal.
Sure.
There have to be collaterals in a deal like that. So they say,
that also included airports, and it also included broadcasting stations, and they lost them.
Yeah.
Of course, it was the choice of the countries, but it's also the way that China does business, which you do not see by Europeans, Japanese, Koreans, Americans.
Yeah.
And so, of course, that does reflect on China.
Right.
So anyway, you had the Belt and Road losing its shine.
Yeah.
And from we have the global South. Now there's the global East, the global West, the global North.
Yeah.
But you have the advanced world, or global North, basically looking at what's happening inside China and becoming concerned. I think Israelis did tune into Hambantota and some of this other, that makes it into the financial news of Israel.
Yeah.
And so people were aware of that and didn't sit well. At the same time, you had the U.S. administration regularly coming to Israel to find out what's going on with the Haifa port and saying, "Be careful, China. There's a lot of risk."
Investments in general.
And honestly, when I started to see a lot of money flowing into Israel, I also turned to the government and said, if you do business with China and you don't understand it, you are probably going to lose. Yeah. It's a risk.
Yeah.
You have to know your customer. You have to know your investor.
Yeah,
and China
absolutely.
is not. It's not Europe. It's not even Russia. China is a unicorn. It is a totally standalone, different culture, different mindset. And if you don't know it, how can you possibly succeed?
Yeah.
But I don't even know now. I don't even think now that it's not in the nature of the system to take into account cultural differences. Although there are individuals within the government who do, and certainly we have an outstanding China desk in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who have a lot of China knowledge and expertise.
Yep.
Unfortunately, they don't have an opportunity to spread that knowledge throughout the rest of the government.
Yeah, and that's, if we get into all the problems of the Israeli political system and so on, we won't get out of it. But I do want to ask you something, Carice. You've been running the Signal conferences throughout the years. I was fortunate enough to be invited to some of those and some of also the closed roundtable sessions, which were always fascinating, filled with very knowledgeable, experienced experts and formers, לשעברים of different kinds, like you've mentioned. And I think these are, first of all, very, very important to keep on doing. So thank you for that. But in the last one, you came up with something that felt to me like what in the startup world we say it's like kind of a pivot, like it's not China.
A pivot. It's not a pivot.
It's not. I know. But I mean, it is something that felt to me like it's a part of an understanding that things are different now. And we need to figure out a different strategy to keep that impact, which is, by the way, it's not in any way a bad thing, because in the end, if you see that the environment is different and the players think different, if you stick to your same strategy that seemed to get to your top level goal, which you've mentioned, importing Israel's stance vis-a-vis China, what was true for 2010 is by definition should not be true in 2024. And what I'm referring to in your latest initiative is what you refer to, wink to Xi Jinping as the GII, the Global Israel Initiative.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that? What was the logic behind launching that and what its goals are?
Sure. This is, the automatic response is like a pivot, or as donors would say, mission creep. Which is a gigantic no-no.
Yeah.
Both of them are a no-no, and also not wouldn't make any sense. We are China experts. We do China. But it's exactly the situation that you described, because circumstances changed, and I started to talk about that in the 2020. In 2021, first of all, we signed the Abraham Accords in 2020.
Yeah.
That was sort of the beginning of China's more aggressive approach towards Israel.
Yeah.
Foreign Minister Wang Yi was anti-Abraham Accords. He went straight to the virtual meeting of BRICS and said, nobody support this. This is not a good thing. The U.S. is trying to turn the Abraham Accords into the security architecture of the Middle East, and it shouldn't be that. It should be the JCPOA, and we are against it. And in fact, China thought, believing in a lot of conspiracy theories, that the U.S. had designed this program to push the Chinese out of the Middle East, which of course was never on the mind of the Americans until China pushed back repeatedly and was doing more and more very advanced defense tech development with the UAE and also Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, I think there are reasons, I think some of the reasons that the Gulf turned towards China, especially Saudi Arabia is due to the human rights pressures and criticisms that the U.S. placed on Saudi Arabia. And the way that the U.S. does business, I think everybody could have a lot of criticism. I certainly do. Because first they caused a lot of trouble by pushing Saudi Arabia away, and then they went back and now they're trying to provide a lot of carrots to pull it back.
Right.
The mess that they created, it's costing them a lot to try to fix. I think honestly, I mean, maybe this is not something that should be said on this podcast, but I do think that that October 7th wouldn't have happened if the U.S. had embraced Saudi Arabia and we had normalization years ago. There would have been no opportunity for an October 7. But you never know.
Yeah, the U.S. made a lot of mistakes on the Saudi Arabia front, which they're now trying to, as you mentioned, to roll back. But it's more difficult, and we lost a lot of precious time.
I tend to look at things from a very wide perspective and quite a lot of distance, and I get a lot of pushback from people about my assessments because they aren't common. But nonetheless, this is how I see things. And in 2021, there were a few things that happened. First of all, after a year of huge success of the Abraham Accords, the Chinese changed their tune. And this was a very important lesson for us, that when you're successful, the Chinese come around. They will bet on the winning horse.
Right.
And the problem that they saw is that Israel's advancement of the Abraham Accords, on the one hand, they were supporting it. When they saw an opportunity to push back against it, they did, because they saw that we sort of bring the U.S. with us, maybe, or the more that we're doing advanced tech defense work in UAE, maybe that's going to, first of all, maybe that's going to become a problem for them, or maybe they can use that as a way to push us out, which in the end they were able to do, at least temporarily, with G40. I think because of the relationship of G42.
Although now, again, the U.S.
now
is
it's
trying
back
to...
with... No, it's not just the U.S. It's UAE decided that it's worth it to work with the U.S. and Microsoft or Google.
Right, it's Microsoft.
Microsoft.
I think,
but in 2021, we had a Gaza war. And China took the opportunity of having the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council to put forward a number of votes that were not good for Israel, because they were calling for the early end of the war, sound familiar, before Israel felt it was safe. And when the U.S. Vetoed those votes, China said the U.S. was on the wrong side of morality. So this was an indicator of the direction China was going, to say that the U.S. is on the wrong side of morality because it's supporting the defense of Israel. That puts China on the opposite side of Israel, that China is not, is being more aggressive, negatively aggressive towards Israel. And I looked at what was happening in China, as I discussed a few minutes ago, and now with this, and became concerned about what we should be doing, we Signal should be doing, in order to empower Israel to deal with this more assertive, aggressive China. And yes, we do have, we have the engagement, although that engagement was from a distance because of COVID. But a lot of thought about what will empower Israel from the perspective of China to cause China to recalculate its approach to Israel. And, we had an internal discussion. We have an outstanding policy expert in Signal, Tommy Steiner. And he actually wrote a paper. His thesis years ago was on middle powers. And I was very interested in the Indo-Pacific. I thought, I saw those countries as, they're not anti-Semitic. They are growing. They are, the weight of the global economy is moving in that direction. And they have issues. They have their own defense issues. And Israel is a really good defense supplier. India was already our major buyer of defense. the number one, certainly in Asia. And it seemed that there would be a very good opportunity. So we started to put our heads together between Middle Power, Indo-Pacific, and we came up with, and Tommy coined it, the Global Israel Initiative, which was inspired by China's, Xi Jinping's Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative.
Right.
And those initiatives, Xi Jinping has said, are fashioned to reshape global governance to better suit China.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for Israel? What does that mean for democracies? For the time being, the picture looks like, we don't know exactly, but it looks like it won't be so good for democracies to have things shaped to such an extent to suit China's interests. We could be wrong, but that's how it looks. And certainly the specifics of some of those initiatives don't look good for Israel. And in the name of the Global Security Initiative, China has said that it wants to take the Palestinian-Israeli conflict to the United Nations, to a major world conference. And we all know how welcome Israel is in the UN, and at any conference. As soon as you have the numbers, and China wants to play the numbers game.
Of course, because it suits their purpose.
It is the largest trading partner of most countries. It has leverage. Xi Jinping has also said we need to build asymmetries. And they're building asymmetries with countries so that his point is they need to depend on us more than we depend on them. And it's understandable because China imports most of its food and most of its energy. And the country cannot survive without that food and energy.
Right.
So they need to have those votes so that when things like yesterday was the ramming of the Philippine ship. And it was yesterday or day before yesterday. And when those things happen, if something comes, or in Xinjiang or whatever, they will have the votes in the United Nations. And we've seen it many times when 27 European ambassadors wrote a letter to the UN, I guess, about concern over the Uyghurs. The Chinese brought, 50 signatures from Muslim countries, including all of the Arab states.
None of the Muslim countries really have problems with what's happening in Xinjiang. Only with what's happening in Gaza, I guess.
Yes. So the Global Israel Initiative aims to cultivate ties with Indo-Pacific countries, bilateral ties first, and then to build interest-based minilaterals where they are intrinsically valuable to the countries involved. And it would be Israel initiating with these Indo-Pacific countries, but also bringing in Middle East countries and European countries where they can contribute and benefit. And offer an opportunity for joint R&D, investment, business, trade, because Israel can do with these countries the things that it always was very challenged in doing with China. We can work with them in cyber, in chip design, in nanotechnology, all of the fourth industrial revolution, cutting-edge technologies. If we can come together, work together, be successful, all benefit, and at the same time, it sends a message to China that we have strategic autonomy, influence, we are successful. That will affect its calculation. And by the way, it will also show the Americans that Israel can work with its friends and allies without the U.S. necessarily having to be involved.
Exactly. That's something that, it's obviously with you guys, it's focused on improving Israel's stance vis-a-vis China, but it's something that would help Israel's stance in the world altogether, because this is our strong point, the technology, the science, the ability to cooperate on these critical emerging technologies and so on. And this is what would give us power compared to, when we're working with Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Japan, or Korea, or Vietnam, or Thailand, or what have you.
That is the middle power factor.
Exactly.
Where we punch above our weight on a global level. We already are, but it's not the mindset that we have. We think very regional. We need to lift our eyes beyond the region and go global, mainly, in my view, focused on the Indo-Pacific, because the potential there is huge. And they need what we have. And they're more and more interested in what Israel can provide. And by the way, after this war, I think we're going to see a massive blossoming, if you can use that word, when it comes to defense technology.
Yeah. But definitely.
So many new ideas and so much new technology, which will be very valuable for those who are confronting all kinds of issues in the South China Sea and other issues in the Indo-Pacific.
And nowadays it's pretty much every country. I won't say lucky for us because of the situation, but it's definitely something that would have a lot of demand. I fully agree. So maybe one closing sentence for our fascinating conversation today, Carice. If you see one path to promote this GII concept, the Global Israel Initiative, what would that look like?
I think the first thing Israel needs to do is develop and publish an Indo-Pacific strategy. Countries that are, although we are in the Indo-Pacific, we are connected to it. And the Middle East is part of that front that goes from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. We are all in this together. But there are countries who are not connected at all, like Canada and the Czech Republic, that have developed Indo-Pacific strategies. Israel should not be concerned about making public its Indo-Pacific strategy. That will open a lot of doors in the Indo-Pacific. With respect to the U.S., it will gain a lot of respect and status for Israel, and I think it will be a calling card for Israel to do a great deal of business in the area where there's a lot of demand and a lot of money.
And arguably the future of the world in the next few decades, and we definitely should be part of that.
Right.
I fully agree. I just hope that, we'll be able to lift our head from all the immediate term things that we have to deal with right now. Hope that will come soon. But thank you very much, Carice, for this fascinating conversation, sharing from your insights and experience. It was great.
It was a great pleasure, and I want to tell you, if we have anything to say about it, we're absolutely going to be there in the Indo-Pacific. I'm very, very enthusiastic about it, very confident. I think Israel has all the potential, and I'm talking to more and more people inside government who are seeing the vision and wanting to go there.
Very happy to hear that. Thank you, Carice.
Thank you.
תודה רבה שהגעתם עד כאן, תודה רבה לקאריס וויטי שהייתה איתנו כאן היום וחלקה מהידע והתובנות שלה, תודה רבה לגיל ולצוות אולפני טריו הנהדרים ולכל צוות הפודקאסטים של רלוונט. מקווה שנהנתם מהשיחה שלנו היום, ועד הפעם הבאה, צייצ'ן.